All right, I'm here with Ben, who's on Twitter at Atticus Amber. We're going to talk about some politics, some religion, the whole there's big issues and the current events. So I sort of asked for some questions for people to put out there, just sort of get the conversation started. And one person said they were interested in the 2020 election. So I thought we'd start off with that. So I just want to say, just to begin with, I think it's very, very premature to talk about the 2020 election. In general, you really don't know. You can't predict what's going to happen because you don't know who the candidates are. You haven't had the 2018 election, which sort of sets the table. And I think, as far as I'm looking at it, the candidates who are sort of in the limelight right now for the Democrats, none of them seem like someone who they ought to settle for and sort of sit down and say, okay, we have Bernie Sanders, we have Elizabeth Warren, we have Joe Biden. All the people who are sort of rumored as these people who are strong contenders, I think have a lot of baggage and aren't necessarily the person you want to settle on just yet, especially since you have so much time to consider it. What's your thought on that going forward?
Look, I think that's right. I don't think that necessarily means that you shouldn't talk about who's a 2020 contender. I think you find your 2020 contender by talking about it, by looking at people who might be good at it. But you wait for the 2018 election, but so I think it's a legitimate topic of conversation. But I also agree with you that even if everyone suddenly agreed on someone, you wouldn't necessarily say, well, then we can't talk about anyone else, because you've got 2 years, well, we've got 4 years, 3 years to make that decision. But it does seem to me that there's a bunch of. Well, so one thing I will say is, you said baggage. It's one of the really frustrating things about American politics, that the people who have acquired the experience and to some extent the sort of hard-won cynicism to be good at managing the federal government tend to have gathered so many bruises in public that they couldn't win an election, which I think is the story of Hillary Clinton to some extent. Whereas, the people who are clean skins, who've never been involved in politics, who had very little involvement in politics, are often less competent. Trump being a almost ridiculous example of that.
Yeah. Well,
so and we got lucky with Obama, because although I think Obama suffered from some naivety, which made him cause some mistakes early on, he was an incredibly talented and wise guy, who I think, given his paucity of national political experience, did extraordinarily well. But it's that problem. But I think maybe all countries have that, because you notice even in parliamentary systems, the leaders who do well electorally are the leaders who are fresh faces. Although they then their cabinets are full of crusty old experienced hands.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of our sort of media and our political system was incredibly unfair to Hillary in 2016 on numerous scores, where we sort of everyone sort of agreed that she was a corrupt, awful person, when I think a lot of the sort of knocks against her you could make, or knocks against almost any politician. And, people talked more about her, supposed corruption than Trump's evident corruption.
Actual corruption, yes. And people talked about Trump's, odd ties to various odd regimes in the same sentence as they talked about the Clinton Foundation. People seem to forget that the Clinton Foundation is a charity. And not only is it a charity, it's a charity that scores incredibly highly on those ratings of how much money actually goes to projects versus how much gets spent on overhead. Well, yes. If you donate $1 million to the Clinton Foundation, some percentage of that $1 million is going to go on the private jets and the offices and the cocktail parties that are done to raise more money. Absolutely, but the bodies that rate charities described the Clinton Foundation as having one of the lowest overheads for a charity of its size. And it also did, extraordinarily good work in Africa, and in various other places with AIDS medication. And, it was a real, genuine charity. You look at the Trump Foundation, and it was a scam to direct money to Trump's art collection, etc. It's just chalk and cheese.
Yeah. And
there
is a problem. But I think when it comes to 2020, when you're looking at it, a lot of it comes down to the fact that I don't really care that much about which candidate is going to be the best president, because any candidate, any Democrat, would be immeasurably better than Trump. So
absolutely. Like Bernie Sanders, who I would have had real worries about his ability to govern, would still have been massively better than Trump.
Yeah, exactly. And I think if I could find a candidate who was 95% assured to win versus a candidate who was slightly more, who's going to be a better president, but was 40% likely to win, I'm going to go with a candidate who's going to be a worse president, who's 95% likely to win. I think that it's a calculation. When you have a re-election campaign, I think generally people are much more pragmatic, and they're much more concerned about who can we get who's going to beat the guy in office right now. And people are much less idealistic. I mean, that's why in 2004, the Democrats nominated John Kerry instead of Howard Dean. And why the Republicans in 2012, they nominated Romney instead of one of their, Santorum or Gingrich, who are more of the Trump-like candidate. So,
by the way, while I'm very glad that Obama beat Romney, I would give a lot to have Romney in the White House rather than Trump.
Yeah, I think a lot of, in so many ways, I agree with you. Although you don't want to minimize how dangerous Mitt Romney would have been as president, because although he wasn't,
because he wasn't. Yeah, look, there's no doubt he would have actually been able to get things done. I mean, Romney is a less dangerous version of how dangerous a President Pence would be. I mean, Mike Pence. That's actually one of the things I wonder, which is, does it change your decision about a 2020 candidate? As to whether that candidate will be facing Trump or Pence. I actually don't think it does, because I think if Trump burns out, and I think there's a sort of a 50-50 chance that he will, then Pence is likely to have been splattered with so much of the collateral shit spray that I think it's the same campaign. I mean, a campaign against a campaign against Pence is probably very similar to a campaign against President Ford after Nixon, which is that the guy will just be so compromised by his association with his predecessor. But Pence is an incredibly dangerous prospect, and
well, I think you can,
but he's still better than Trump.
Well, I think when you look at the Republican Party at this point in time, it's a very radical, sort of fundamentalist party when it comes to their beliefs about how the economy is supposed to work, how you treat poor people. These very basic things, they're very, very extreme in the context of, I don't know, world politics, or how most experts in economics would actually tell you to govern. And it's
the Republican Party the Republican Party seems to me to be divided into three fractions. The faction that wants oligarchy, the Republican billionaires faction. Yeah. The faction that wants theocracy, that is the Christian fundamentalists, and the faction that wants fascism, the white nationalists. And interestingly, those three groups do actually conflict. Oligarchy doesn't necessarily like full-on white nationalism, because because corporate oligarchs like immigration because of its economic stimulus effect, and because they need Mexicans to raise their children. And the theocrats, most of them are sincere Christians, albeit disturbingly medieval ones. So they have a conflict with the oligarchs, because the Christians do have some belief in caring for the poor in some fashion, although that tends to be the Republican Party's worked out how to suppress that or how to redirect that. But there is that tension.
That is an interesting point about religion. I think if you look at a lot of the left-leaning Christian denominations, they're actually kind of much closer to what I would view as the basic doctrine of Christianity, which a lot of it's based on helping poor people, right? That's kind of what Jesus was. Jesus was this sort of revolutionary figure who a lot of what he was talking about was income inequality, in the context of, the 2000.
Yes, but there's an important difference. Christianity had always been involved with caring for the poor, and it was an incredibly useful recruitment tool because you basically, as a suppressed religion, you recruited the poor.
Right.
But there's an important point. You've got to remember Jesus at one point saying, the poor will always be with us. And you need to then flash forward to Mother Teresa saying that the deaths of poor people in her houses of the dying without anaesthetic were a marvelous thing because those people participated in a small way in the suffering of Christ on the cross. Christianity doesn't want to abolish poverty. Christianity wants to sanctify it and ease it somewhat.
Well,
so it wasn't revolutionary. It was kind of ameliorative.
Right.
And to some extent, Jesus' point, the poor will always be with us, sort of made sense in the economics of a pre-industrial society. But yes, the good liberal Christians from Wesley onwards have then said, let's not just care for the poor, let's abolish poverty. And the Catholic Church, at least the liberal.
I think there is a great tradition of liberal Christianity in the United States,
yes.
Going back to the abolitionist movement. So there is this liberal current to all of that, and you really don't tend to see that in the evangelical Christianity of what we saw in 2016. And what was so sort of amazing was the fact that we had Donald Trump, who is this guy who has no personal morality whatsoever, embraced as this great Christian leader, which it's.
And you see on Twitter, when you put that to some of the Trumpies, they say, "Oh yes, but King Solomon was a bad man too." Sometimes bad, immoral men are chosen of God to lead the people home. And I'm just thinking, can you listen to yourself and how much of like a cult you sound? That they can twist themselves into anything. But yes, look, the Republican Party, it seems to have an incentive structure now that means that the good Republicans, or those Republicans that do actually have good impulses, end up being forced into, either to abandon those impulses or to compromise them. I mean, the best example would be someone like John McCain, who, in the past has made noises that would cause me to strongly respect him as someone who I disagree with on many issues, but who I have enormous respect for. But John McCain and Lindsey Graham are the two most Trump skeptical Republican legislators, and they've both made appalling compromises. So,
I think a lot of that tends to be that there's no real limit for these people when it comes to compromising their political party. It's always party first, country second. And John McCain is someone who's gotten this incredible reputation as this maverick and a political independent. And you look at his actual track record, and he's a conservative Republican who's a party loyalist on 95% of the time. His only sort of time where he was a little bit more independent was the 2000 election and the aftermath of that. And I think whatever reputation he earned in that period, he's certainly pissed away since then. And obviously you respect the fact that he was he was a pilot and he was tortured for our country. But as a politician, he's nothing special. I mean,
I agree with that, but it's also because it goes back to the problem with the party. The incentive structure is such that someone, even if you are a good Republican, if you stick to your principles, you're going to be primaried and lose your seat. And if you want to maintain the support of the base, you keep having to make these small compromises. Look, I think the answer is that in 2020 we want someone who can win.
Right.
And that, in part, that means someone. I think that means someone who can appeal to the kind of white working class. I hate that phrase, but that kind of that group of people who shifted from from Obama voters to Trump voters, without scaring away the suburban middle class vote. I think the answer to that is Elizabeth Warren. I mean, and I think the Republicans think the answer to that is Elizabeth Warren, because they are so dedicated to damaging her reputation. They're really trying to take her out. And I think the reason why they focus on her so much is because she could be such a threat. The question is whether she'll be so damaged by the time we get to 2020 that
I hesitate to say this, but I think there's a real pattern when it comes to recent political history and the way we tend to treat female politicians in the media and in the public. There's a sort of a dogpiling on a woman, a female politician, and sort of interpreting her actions as a very nefarious and very evil when they're just sort of exactly what every other politician does. You know, if a woman is very ambitious, it's seen as this awful, conniving thing. Whereas if a man is ambitious, it's looked at as a very positive thing. And I think
look an example of that with Elizabeth Warren is that Pocahontas thing. I mean, when you actually look at what happened, her family had always said, the family had always said that they had, distant sort of 1/16th, 1/32nd Native American heritage.
That's what every family in America has a story, basically.
There was some evidence though, because there's photos and there's a whole lot of stuff that suggests that she genuinely believed that. Harvard then sends around a circular saying, we've got a problem with minorities on the faculty and we're doing an audit. So is there anyone here who actually is a minority who we don't know about? Because we want to make sure that we're, before we start doing an outreach program, we want to make sure that we've got, that we know how many people. And Warren basically said, well, I've got distant Native American blood. So yes, but I've never suffered discrimination because of it, like a person saying who passes as white, saying, yeah, my great grandfather was black. You know what I mean? She didn't push it forward she answered a question, maybe stupidly asking the question, but I suspect that the time she answered the question, she never thought she was going to be in politics.
Right. Well, she's also from Oklahoma, and I think we all know Oklahoma was the Native American territory where we sent these people we deported in the Trail of Tears. So I think every white person in Oklahoma tends to think that they're part Native American, and a lot of people in these tribes, in the Cherokee tribe, are maybe they're 25% Native American or 1/8, and it's not as simple as either you're Native American or not. And a lot of times our sort of discussion of race tends to sort of have this all or nothing view of it, when it's so much more complicated. But yeah, that story is nonsense. But I mean, I lived in New York City for the mayoral primary in 2013, and we had this woman, Christine Quinn, she was the front runner, and she was the person who had the biggest sort of platform going into it, because she was the speaker of the city council, and her campaign crashed and burned. And she was this female politician, and she became basically a piñata. And you saw that with Hillary Clinton too. I mean, a lot of these people who, what they accepted about Obama, without question, like Obama was against gay marriage until 2012, right?
Yes.
That was not,
as was Joe Biden, as was
Bernie Sanders. Every politician was like that. But when it comes to Hillary Clinton,
to be fair to Bernie Sanders switched earlier than most people, but he still switched late by comparison to the Democratic base.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that was an issue that it switched so quickly that a lot of politicians were sort of left sort of flat-footed on it, because at one point in maybe 2005, if you were pro-gay marriage, your presidential chances were gone. You were radioactive politically. And that was even more true in 1992 when Bill Clinton ran for president. But there was this, viewing of Hillary Clinton's evolving on the issue that sort of made it into this horrible political, conniving, choice for her, or we just sort of take every other politician, we give them a free pass. So when it comes to Elizabeth Warren,
so what you're saying is what we're saying is that Elizabeth Warren's discriminated. It should be disqualified because she doesn't have a penis.
No,
I'm joking.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm struggling with. Looking forward to that, and I think I'm struggling with it. When I was in college, I interned for a female politician in Tucson, Arizona, and Gabby Giffords, and obviously she was a very popular politician, and her situation is sort of sui generis, but horrible, but
yes.
not the same sort of thing. But I've just sort of paid attention to women in politics of late, and I think it's everyone who cares about equality of the sexes and cares about everyone's a feminist needs to sort of reckon with how they view women in politics, and how we can sort of change our politics to be more accepting of women. But when it comes to Elizabeth Warren, you look at her 2012 Senate run, she underperformed Obama by a large margin, and whenever you look at all these politicians running against Trump, you have to say, what could possibly go wrong for them? And I hate to say it, but I think you have to look at, has this politician sort of, are they going to play into the sort of negative stereotypes we have about female politicians, and how do you counteract that? I wouldn't want to make that the deciding factor, but I think sadly when it comes to Warren, I think that's how she's going to be perceived.
Yeah, look, it depends on how good she is at countering it. She can be very eloquent and very snappy and very good when she wants to be. I've also seen her be a little bit disappointing. I remember seeing her in a long sort of panel discussion with Paul Krugman, where Paul Krugman had come to have a policy discussion and Elizabeth Warren had come to roll out her talking points, which are good talking points. But it may be that she was just in that mode. But so I think it comes down to whether her performance as a stump politician is good enough to overcome that. The problem with Hillary was that she had that disadvantage of being female, plus she had the disadvantage that in the Clinton family, all the electoral charisma is on Bill's side.
I wouldn't say all of it, but
but most of it, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And I mean, to some extent, that's an unfair comparison because Clinton was a bit of a electoral genius, but she's not a natural candidate in the way that Biden or Clinton was. Then again, it has to be said, Obama wasn't a natural candidate either. I mean, Obama, like Clinton, didn't like campaigning.
Yeah, Obama was not as much of a what they call like a retail politician, where he was so great at shaking hands, but he was this sort of rock star figure, which it allowed him to campaign very effectively.
Yeah. So look, I think we want someone who can appeal to the issues that Bernie appealed to, and that's not just a matter of what your policies are, because if you looked at Hillary's actual policies, they were
very progressive. They were the most.
They were very progressive. She ran the most progressive platform that the Democrats had ever run.
Right.
But you also someone who has that horrible word authenticity, which Warren has, but she has the woman problem. And so it'll be a question as to anyone else. But there's also, someone like Cory Booker's interesting. He's got an interesting story. He does, people like the Young Turks have a go at him for being very corporate and taking a lot of corporate donations. But I'm quite impressed. I'm quite impressed with Booker, I have to say. And I think the dark horse is what happens with the Castro brothers in 2018, whether they decide to risk it all on running for statewide office or not, and whether they win.
Well, actually, the guy who's running for Senate right now in Texas against Cruz is Beto O'Rourke.
Yes.
I think if any Democrat actually wins the Texas Senate seat, they might actually just decide they're going to keep that seat, because it's the Democrats don't want to give it up, because that would be such a ridiculous situation to hold that seat even for 6 years. But there's a lot of Democrats who people are sort of looked at as a dark horse, and I think just personally, having lived in Minnesota for Al Franken's Senate election in 2008, he would be a great candidate, and I think he would be able to sort of bring the progressive Bernie Sanders wing and sort of speak on those economic inequality and issues very effectively.
I'm not saying he couldn't do this, but with Al Franken, I haven't yet seen him be presidential. I've seen him be analytical, and indeed, I remember thinking he must be a lawyer at one point, and then I looked him up, and in fact, his background is in pure maths. I've seen him being very analytical, and I've seen him be very funny, and politically funny.
Yeah, I've also heard that I've heard there's no chance he's going to run. So,
yeah, look, and people change. People can have their minds changed, but I'm not saying Franken couldn't do the serious, somber presidential thing, but I haven't seen that from him yet. Look, I've been. Al Franken with one question blew Sessions out of the Russia investigation. You've got to give him credit, and also we know he's incredibly funny. I have to say the best political put down I've heard in years was his line about Ted Cruz, where he says, "You have to understand, of all the 100 senators, I'm probably the senator who likes Ted Cruz the most, and I hate Ted Cruz."
Yeah, that was pretty good. Yeah, but yeah. So I think we sort of see that fairly similarly when it comes to 2020. But just I think the next thing I was sort of thinking about in talking to you was we've had this recent thing where there was a clip of Sam Harris's discussion with Majid Nawaz posted by, I'm not sure who posted it originally, and
I think it was posted by this guy Sasha Sayan. I think I'm pronouncing his name right. Who's like a small, he's got approximately the same number as Twitter followers as you or I. But it got picked up and retweeted by various people, including Reza Aslan.
Right. So basically the clip, if you guys haven't heard it, is he's discussing sort of I guess what he would say he's giving the perspective of someone who's more on the sort of anti-immigrant far right, and sort of putting it in his, like, what he says sort of this steel manning, or giving the strongest argument for what he sees as he's steel manning the Trump Muslim ban position. Right. He's saying this is the best argument for the Trump Muslim ban. This is what the most rational Trump voter would say in defense of the Muslim ban. Right. And he also says, and that's not irrational, that's not stupid. That argument actually, he's saying, I can see where that argument comes from. I can see why someone would come to that view. But you've got to understand two things about the context of that. The first is he raises it to steelman and then to try and knock it down. Right. And secondly, not just in the podcast, but elsewhere on his other podcasts, in a blog post on national television with Bill Maher, Sam Harris has condemned the Muslim ban. Not only has he condemned the Muslim ban, he's condemned any form of Muslim immigration ban. And he has said that we have a moral duty to allow genuine refugees from Syria in, but we also have a moral duty to filter for, the sort of problems that can bring in. And he said that the most important people to let into the United States and even give citizenship are ex-Muslims, liberal Muslims, secular Muslims, and moderate Muslims. So you've got to read what he says there in those two contexts. So he wasn't advocating for. You can't criticize him for advocating for a Muslim ban, because he wasn't. What you could possibly criticize him for is the fact that he's clearly got sympathy for the people who argue for it, for ordinary voters who are attracted to the idea. He expresses an understanding of why they come to this opinion that he thinks is wrong, and a kind of a sympathy for why they come to. He says it's not irrational, it's an understandable reaction.
Now,
Right.
you can criticize him for that, and that would be an interesting nuanced argument as to whether he gives too much credit to, the so-called white working class voter who's, concerned about these problems. But that's not what Razor and Sasha and all those people were criticizing him for. Sorry, I've gone on a bit there.
Well, I think if you listen to it, it sounds, out of context, it does sound very xenophobic and very sort of fearful about potential of living with a group of people who have the Muslim faith, right? And that does, I think, genuinely sound to people very sort of hateful, and almost you're sort of arguing for a position that it feels icky to hear someone say that. If there's like a visceral reaction anyone would have to that, where it sounds really, it really grates on your ears if you have a sympathy for Muslims who are being oppressed and are like. There's this sort of pathological fear you get, and a lot of the people who are fans of Sam Harris, I've noticed this, they have this incredibly pathological fear of Muslims and this demonizing of them that I think anyone who actually is not racist would see that as, like it strikes that chord of icky, right?
Yeah, look, it absolutely does. I agree with that. Now, what Sam's doing there, though, is something that does have to be done, which is that you do need to understand why people hold views that you find disgusting or wrong, because the only way you're going to persuade them out of it is to understand that. Now, and this is also a point that people on the left make, which I think is a good point, which is that it's necessary to understand why people become jihadists and why people become terrorists. Mm-hmm. And to Sam's credit, he's done a lot of that. I mean, he points out that, and especially after his conversation with Majid, he says, look, there is, when you have grievances or when you are in an oppressed circumstance, what you do about that circumstance is you fall back on beliefs that have been inculcated in you because of your culture, which is why you have a lot more Muslim suicide bombers in Palestine than you have Christian suicide bombers in Palestine. Yeah, but you've got to understand that there's multiple. One factor is the software you're running on your brain, but the other factor is what's activating that software, the grievances, the problems that are there.
Well, and I think on the other hand, though, I don't know if it does much good to talk about Muslim people when the people who are part of ISIS and Al-Qaeda are from this one school of Islamic thought, sort of Salafi Islam, right? And
yeah, although that's a pretty well-subscribed school of Islamic thought. I mean, the problem you have is that Salafi, that school, those associated schools of Islam, largely because they've been propagated with huge amounts of Saudi money, are not a tiny minority. They aren't the David Koresh of Islam.
Oh, I mean,
they are the Pat Robertson of Islam. They are in some countries they are a majority. In other countries they are a minority. But where they are a minority, they are a large minority.
Well, I think it sort of speaks to this sort of interesting thing about the globalization of religion, is that the sort of globalized version of all these different religions tends to be the more fundamentalist. You see that in the sort of Pentecostal religion that's and Mormonism, which are spreading, pretty quickly around the world. Whereas you have these mainline Protestant churches, which are more sort of stodgy, moderate, Christianity that, sort of the Episcopal version of Christianity, are not spreading the same rate and are not sort of spurred on by globalization and those sort of.
The one exception to that would be the relatively robust performance of Catholicism in the developing world,
Right.
and that and the sort of Catholicism that does well in the third world is actually quite it's actually quite economically left wing, certainly not socially liberal.
Right.
It's the kind of Catholicism that's produced the current Pope. But that, of course, has a massive organisation behind it, which sort of gives it something of an advantage. You know, the Catholic Church is the oldest consistently running institution in the world. So,
right. Well,
but
I guess to me, I think when Sam Harris talks about this stuff, I think there's a lack of sensitivity to the Muslim Americans or Muslim people in general who don't hold those beliefs and aren't likely to hold like, you know, who are just basically normal people who are going about their lives, and their religion is something they practice, and it's not a negative thing, and it's not like an inherently political thing they're pushing, you know, in their life. And you sort of, if someone is sort of not imposing their religion on other people, and they're perfectly normal, nice human beings, I think it's a lot to sort of associate with the people who are pushing, you know, radical or fundamentalist views, or are.
There's two separate problems here, because and Majid, Sam talks about this now, but largely because Majid Nawaz introduced the idea to him, which is that there are the radicals, the Islamists,
Right.
And then there are the conservative Muslims, and in a lot of issues, I mean, you know, Majid says, look, with conservative Muslims, you have to have this Janus-based approach. They don't like the Islamists either, and so you want to ally with them in you know, trying to prevent the radicalization of their children. But at the same time, they hold some views that a decent liberal society would be radically opposed to. You know, there are you know, appallingly homophobic and misogynistic views in the conservative Islamic community.
I mean,
And there's empirical evidence for that. So you have this concern where, but your problem with conservative Muslims is the same problem you have with hyper conservative Christians. You know, with your quiverfuls and your submitted wives and those sort of Christians.
Right, but isn't there this tension though when it comes, because it is true that if you have a person coming from the third world, there's a different sort of set of values that are common. You know, people who are Chinese immigrants are going to be much more homophobic, for example, than people, you know, than the average American. And if you just took the average American from 1990 and they were coming to America in 2017, they'd be much more homophobic. And there is this thing of, we sort of assume that people from China and India and Japan coming to the United States, we assume that they're going to assimilate into our culture. And there's, I think, a little bit more sensitivity to the fact that, you know, there's an assimilation process, and there's a view of these people that they're essentially good and decent people who, if they integrate into our society and we can reason with them like they're anyone else, we're not going to automatically have these sort of problems. And I think there's this tension inherent there, where I think I think Sam Harris is failing to be offended enough by the vitriol and hatred people have for the average Muslim who's done nothing wrong. And there's I think we all need to have a lot of we need to understand that if someone gets viewed as negatively, very negatively, like they're a terrorist or they're hateful of other people because of their ethnic background, which I sort of put, you know, religion in with that, because of how they were brought up, we immediately attach a negative stereotype to them. That act, even if you might want to say like whatever statistics you can use to argue for it, that act, I think, is on a person-to-person level, is something that we should resist very strenuously. And I think there's something very wrong about it. And that fact that Sam Harris is not crediting that, I think it strikes people as, you know, like he's ignoring the real problem of racism and bigotry towards Muslims.
So there's two things I want to say about that. The first is your point about integrating conservative Chinese people or whatever is well taken, but there's an important difference, which is that when conservatives from those other cultures come here, especially America, but even in Europe, there's this very welcoming but also stern response was, sort of, welcome to the Netherlands, you're entirely welcome here, but by the way, men and women can marry, people can smoke marijuana in the street, and if you don't like that, you're going to have to get used to it. There's a certain criticism that the parts of the left want to accommodate hyper-conservative attitudes amongst Muslims rather than treat them the way you would treat hyper-conservative attitudes amongst any other group. So that's that one piece.
Right.
But the second piece, and I think that's something that Sam has criticised and lots of people have criticised. There's also the point you made, and I liked your comment that Sam is insufficiently offended by anti-Muslim prejudice or insufficiently upset by it. And I think that's right. I actually think that's a fair criticism of Sam. I think this is not so much an excuse for it, but one of the explanations for it is that you have to look at where Sam lives or operates, which is in publishing and in elite journalism and in the green rooms of CNN, where his main critics and his main obstacles to his message are the regressive left. He doesn't live in the kind of trenches of the bowels of Twitter where we see huge amounts of horrible, you and I see huge amounts of horrible racism, or the day-to-day life of someone like Ina Nice Mangoes, who sees herself or her male relatives being spat upon or otherwise treated appallingly on public transport because they're Muslim. He doesn't see it, so he doesn't. He does. Now that's of course is what the left would call privilege. He's blind to it because he doesn't see it. So it's not an excuse, it's an explanation. And I do wish that Sam would express a little bit more outrage about things that he has expressed, where he has expressed criticism of anti-Muslim prejudice, but in a very kind of very clinical way, where he gets much more annoyed about the regressive left. And so I agree with you that it would be better for him to get angrier about these things.
Well, I think if you said a lot of the things people say about Muslims and you said them about Jews, people, and I mean, putting aside the differences in those religions, it would sound to the ear of the average American as much more racist and much more hateful. And, for example, I live in this neighborhood in Brooklyn, and we have this big old mosque. And the guy who runs it is, he's Saudi Arabian trained. He was actually a unindicted co-conspirator in the World Trade Center bombing, and he's a real piece of work. I'll put it that way. He's one of the more sort of famous American Salafi preachers, imams, and I do get the sense that a lot of the people there, the people who are wearing the niqab. I saw someone raising money for someone who was arrested for shooting a U.S. soldier while she was working with Al Qaeda. They're raising money outside the mosque there, and I saw that. I was, whoa, this is not so good. And
these are real reasons to be concerned.
Actually, I looked at their Facebook page after the Orlando attack, and they had posted a video from an associate of Anjem Chowdhury talking about how the gay people are the disbelievers, and the proper punishment for them is execution. And so I totally get, so from a firsthand perspective, I understand that there is a legitimate discussion about, radical Islam, but at the same time, I'm living with lots of Muslim people. Like every bodega in my every little grocery store in my neighborhood is run by guys from Yemen. And to me, if you live with Muslim people and Muslim people, I think you have a natural feeling towards the people you know who are totally normal and like just like you or me, and you hear the sort of vitriol and hatred people have towards Muslim people, and you have a just innate reaction where you just want to say, treat them like you would want to be treated as an individual, not as this group of people who's threatening to your culture. And when you talk like that, it sort of engenders, like this animus. And, I think Sam Harris is responsible for some of the, he's responsible for not talking about it in a very charitable way towards a lot of people. And that, so I do understand why, a lot of people aren't as sympathetic towards him as he would want. That's just my take on things.
Yeah, look, can I just say, when you said, people spoke about Muslims the way they spoke about Jews the way they speak about Muslims, that it would be seen as anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
Look, I think you need to be more granular about this. There's different, there are certain things that are said about the Muslim community that I'm happy to say about the Orthodox Jewish community. I mean, Orthodox Judaism has an enormous problem with misogyny.
Oh yeah.
We have figures that show that domestic violence is actually slightly elevated in the Orthodox, and you've got to imagine there's underreporting there. We have stories of just appalling treatment of women, and we also know that there are appalling attitudes towards homosexuals in the Orthodox and hyper-Orthodox Jewish communities.
Oh,
so
yeah.
I'm prepared to say all those things, but there's an important point here, which is that the Orthodox Judaism is a small part of the Jewish community,
right?
And it's not a rapidly growing part of the Jewish community. Now, if I were a Jew, I'm like 1/16, doesn't count. But if I were a Jew and this was a huge problem, the Orthodox, I would feel, that sort of criticism is something that I think I would deserve, in the sense that it would be, look, you've got a problem in your community and you need to look at it. I think that's entirely right. I would be resentful of the idea that all Jews are misogynist. I would be appalled by that. But a call that said, look, you have this cancer within your community and you are letting it fester, and you have to deal with it. You have to confront it. You have to reform this. Is exactly what it would be uncomfortable to hear. Your first reaction would be, fuck off, this is my community and our business. What are you outsiders doing telling us this? But, that outside pressure would actually might be necessary to basically make that Jewish community deal with its problem. So, and I think it would be entirely appropriate. If we had, and I think that's the analogy to what we have with Islam. What we have with Islam is that there is a problem with hyper-conservative Islam and a problem with radical Islam. It isn't, and there are a lot of ordinary, decent, moderate, even liberal Muslims who have nothing to do with that part of that problem in their community, but also have very little to do with fighting it. And that's understandable, that's human, but it's a problem. And so I do think that the Muslim community should be under some pressure. And here I'm parroting Majid Nawaz. The Muslim community should be should be subjected to some pressure from the outside, but also hopefully from the inside, to face the fact that mosques like the one you talked about in Brooklyn are a real problem. And they need to be dealt with, and they need to be dealt with by the Muslim community. So some level of outside pressure, which is going to feel unpleasant, I think is appropriate. But
it's
this is why I said
it's interesting you mentioned Jews, Orthodox Jews, because I'm half Jewish, and in Brooklyn we have a ton of these Satmar and other the Lubavitch Hasidic Jews, and I don't. It's hard for me. I have no experience with religion at all. My Jewish experience was I've been to Jewish funerals and worn a yarmulke. It's like essentially
Yes.
my experience with Judaism. But so
If you're a Christian, you would be a weddings and funeral Christian.
yeah, yeah. Well, my mom's side is Christian, so I have been to one Christian Christmas thing, but but if someone said, these Jews coming to America are, they're really conservative and they have these views about women, and I would feel like they weren't even talking about me, and I could see a lot of people who are from, I guess today, I mean, there's a Muslim ban thing coming down today, where it's being reinstated to some extent for these countries. You think a lot of people from Iran and Sudan and these countries, I mean, a lot of them aren't Muslim, right? A lot of them are.
Yeah, look, and I absolutely condemn that ban, as does Sam Harris, as does Majid Nawaz. I think that ban is a horrible idea, and it is also a PR disaster. And this is why I think you need to get granular, because I think some criticisms that Muslims find uncomfortable have to be made, and some criticisms don't have to be made and only just make the Muslim community uncomfortable. And you need to be careful of that. Then you need to also understand or take into account how you're going to, you've got a legitimate and true point to make, but making that point is also going to feed the alt-right. You have to do a cost-benefit analysis.
Right, and I think that the connection between just Muslim people, period, because I mean, I think there's this problematic.
Of me.
Whoa.
Sorry, are you there, Alex?
Yep. Yes.
Sorry, I just had a call come in, which
Reset.
Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I think there is a problem.
Sorry. Okay, Alex. Sorry, I just had a technical problem at my end, but I'm back.
Okay. I'm just going to say that there's a problem in viewing people as calling people by the sort of term Muslim, like Muslim American, because these people are not. When you do that, you associate those people with their religious leadership, their church, their mosque, their synagogue. That's who represents them. We don't call Irish people and Italian people Catholic Americans, right? There is this sort of problem where a lot of these people, they're not necessarily especially religious, and they just happen to be people who are from Pakistan, from Iraq, from Iran. They're not, in some sense, what we ought to be doing is viewing them as Iranian Americans, Pakistani Americans, South Asian, whatever. Or we should sort of admit their identities are a little bit more broad and varied, and not sort of put them on the hook for fixing their religion individually and asking them to do that as individuals. It's the people in the religion. It's the imams, the religious leadership, I think, who are the people you want to be talking to about whatever, reforming the religion, rather than demanding that individual people.
But just transfer that across to another religion. I hold individual Catholics responsible for the depredations of the Catholic Church. I mean, my view is, if you are an individual Catholic, then it is, given the way the Catholic Church has behaved, especially recently, you have a response. If you are going to be a Catholic, you have a responsibility to advocate for reform of those sort of things, and you do, to some extent, as an ambassador for your religion, have to answer for this stuff. What did you do in response to the child rape crisis, or leave the church? So there is, I mean, but I think you hold Muslims responsible for the depredations of their faith the same way you hold individual Catholics responsible, which is when the guy says, look, I'm a liberal Catholic, I go to a church which is by a liberal Catholic, we're doing our best, then you kind of go, well, all right. But the other point, sorry, just one question I want to ask is, in Brooklyn, you said that the major mosque is that mosque that has some rather unpleasant connections.
Yeah, well, that's one in my neighborhood that I'm aware of. Yeah.
Sure, but where do the liberal Muslims go to prayers?
I don't
Is there a
know.
liberal mosque?
I don't.
See, this is a really important.
I confess to not being an expert on this.
Yeah. And it may be that there are liberal mosques, but I sometimes wonder that you may have this problem, that as a matter of community solidarity and as a matter of there only being so many Muslims and whatever, that a lot of Muslims will turn up to Friday prayers or turn up to religious events at mosques, knowing that those mosques have these unpleasant connotations, that have these connections.
Oh, well, I'm sure it's like you go to the place that's closest to you. It's like you go to your gym.
You go to the place that's close. Yeah. And again, this is not evil. Catholics do this. They go to church even though they're unhappy with the way the church has behaved. And,
right.
The rest of us look at them and say, look, you are tacitly supporting an organization or a belief system that is doing these things.
Right.
You have to, you have a moral responsibility to do something about that, even if it's only not turn up. And so I think it is right to hold people who are members of a religion responsible for the behavior of or the consequences of that religion. But it's also not right to do it in a blanket way. So yes, it's right to hold Catholics responsible for the child abuse crisis in the Catholic Church. But despite a famously funny joke from Christopher Hitchens, it would be wrong to sack a babysitter just because you found out he was Catholic. Or it would be wrong to immediately assume that you couldn't leave your children with a Catholic priest just because he was a Catholic priest, although it's a funny joke. You can make these calls upon a community to deal with its own dirty laundry, but you have to be careful not to have that turn into prejudice against the community. And I'll agree, and I absolutely agree with you that I think that Sam's effort to understand why people want to have a Muslim ban was the right thing to do. But his absence of outrage at that view, his absence of obvious disgust at a view, which he's been clear that he opposes that view, but his absence of obvious disgust at that view is a concern, is a problem. It may be that it just takes a lot to make the Mr. Spock-like Sam Harris upset, but nevertheless, it's a PR problem for him. And I agree with that. He should show a little bit more outrage about anti-Muslim prejudice, in my view. And he kind of, to some extent, he sort of outsources that to Majid, who's very good on that because, Majid Nawaz was a victim of skinheads and fascists in his youth. But to some extent, that's not good enough. He needs to do a bit of that himself. I agree with that. That Sam, I liked your comment. I probably didn't write it down properly, but I liked your comment. I wrote it down that Sam needs to. Sam is insufficiently offended by anti-Muslim prejudice. So I think he's being criticised for the wrong thing with this comment, with this podcast. I think there is something you can criticise him for, but it's not what everyone's going. He didn't advocate the position he was talking about. Indeed, he opposes the position he was laying out as a devil's advocate. But you can criticise him for being insufficiently offended by that position. You can criticise him for showing too much empathy.
And I would say also there's a certain level of a political naivete from him and a misunderstanding how politics.
Well, yes, I mean that has been the theme of Sam's entire career. Total political naivety. I mean, Sam, from the end of Faith onwards, Sam basically blundered into a minefield wearing a blindfold.
Yeah, and I think he has to sort of recognize much more that he's a political writer in large measure. I think a lot of people view him as, this person who's talking about, these sort of philosophical matters. I don't know. I don't put a whole lot of stock in his neuroscience works. I don't care that much about it or know that much about it, or the sort of this philosophy, you know, free will and all that. I mean, I'm not a very academic guy, so I think a lot of that it doesn't interest me very much. So it doesn't. It goes over my head. But I think the way people perceive him is as a political writer, and that's a lot of the way he's acting in his public life. And I think I think he's very naive about a lot of issues politically, and he says a lot of things I think that are sort of, maybe they're valid as thought experiments, but they're not really valid as a matter of policy and a matter of how you ought to talk about people in public discourse. But I guess I just...
Well, look, the problem is that Sam never set out to be a political writer, and never went through the career that you would expect of a political writer. He has become one by kind of backing into it. I mean, as he said, if 9/11 hadn't happened, he would never have written The End of Faith, and his first book would have been The Moral Landscape, which is a great book, as is Waking. His main books would have been The Moral Landscape and Waking Up, both of which are great books, both of which have changed my mind on important issues. That it was 9/11 that caused him to write The End of Faith. And apparently he wrote it in 4 days. He wrote it in a fury, and then it was published very shortly afterwards, and was thrust by circumstance. And that's, you can run that excuse for a few years after you find yourself as a politically influential figure, but eventually you're going to actually have to learn how the game is played. And Sam has been a political figure for 10 years now. I mean, The End of Faith was published in 2007. Sorry, no, The End of Faith was published in 2003. He's been a political figure for 14 years.
And I think if you view his like social media and his internet presence and who he's had on his show and whose show he's been on, there's an extent to which he has these connections with these kind of dubious people like Joe Rogan, or I don't know, dubious people, but people who have kind of sketchy and kind of have some nefarious ties, you know, like whether it's Douglas Murray, Dave Rubin, Joe Rogan. And when you ally with those people, it sends a lot of messages. And I think his sort of stamp of approval on these people, I don't think he really understands how impressionable a lot of the people in his audience are. They sort of have this maybe sort of cult-like reverence for him. And a lot of them, I think he's not very careful when it comes to his politics or where he sort of hangs his hat. And
well, to be fair, he also is heavily associated with people like Bill Maher and Lawrence O'Donnell and Fareed Zakaria, who I wouldn't call sketchy. Right wing, sketchy fringe figures.
I saw this guy.
Those three people get.
I saw this guy criticizing Sam Harris today, and he was making some good points, partially, on the Majority Report. And although I think you have to say, Sam Harris, he's not very necessarily an expert in Islam or an expert in religion or an expert in...
No, I would disagree with that. I mean, Sam spent 10 years, wandering the world trying out religion after religion after religion. He was like a hippie looking for...
Okay,
this is a guy who has danced with Sufis in India, who has done the whirling dervish stuff with mystical Muslims, who's gone on months long silent retreats with Muslims and with Hindus, who was a bodyguard to the Dalai Lama for a while, who has he
doesn't speak as somebody who has an expertise in Islam or the religion.
Well, he's not a Muslim, but this is a guy who's read the Quran very closely, who's read the Hadith very closely.
Well, he doesn't speak from someone who is his relevant expertise is not in that religion. So that is kind of a a little bit of a difficulty in sort of his like credentialing. So I mean that's part of his argument, is that credentials don't matter, right? That's part of his. He's like a lapsed academic who doesn't believe in the whole sort of credentialing aspect of academics. So.
Well, no. I mean, his point's a little bit more nuanced than that. I mean, what he says is that credentials are a shortcut. That is, if you don't have time and you want to know who to listen to, credentials are a useful shortcut, because if someone has the credentials, then they're going to be more likely to know what they're talking about. But as he points out, he has had on his show physicists who have PhDs from MIT, who recommended to him people who they say are some of the smartest people working in areas of physics who don't have the relevant degrees. So it is possible for people. It is possible for someone to be. But the problem. But it's a signaling device. It's a marker. And if you don't have the credentials, then you're going to have to work a lot harder to be taken seriously. But just because you have the credentials doesn't automatically mean you should be taken seriously.
Yeah, but I guess my perspective is that if you're a person who's making arguments in the public sphere and what you're saying makes sense, then I'll listen to you, and that's essentially where I take him. But I guess I want to move on to the whole the lawsuit against the Southern Poverty Law Center by Maajid Nawaz that just was announced on Bill Maher's talk show on Friday.
Well, the thing about lawsuits against public figures is, whereas and I'm an Australian lawyer, but a lot of Australian, especially defamation of free speech law, is like this ongoing debate with American law, where the Americans, of course, don't listen to us and don't know we're having the debate, but Australians are constantly stealing bits of the law or not stealing bits or criticising bits of it.
Right.
So I'm sort of familiar as an outsider with this law, because I'm familiar with it, because a lot of our debates on how our free speech and defamation law should be structured has been about how much we should be like and unlike them. And the thing to be said is, this case would work. This case would work in the UK. It would be dodgy, and suing a public figure. It works in the UK. It's a dodgy but doable proposition in Australia, and it's extremely difficult in America, because in America, once someone is a public figure, you have to prove that the person who defamed them, you have to prove not only that what they said about you was untrue, but that they knew it was untrue or ought reasonably to have known it was untrue and published it with malicious intent.
Is that the actual malice?
Yeah. Look, the problem is that I'm the term, like in Australia, malice means something different from what it does in the US. But you've got to actually show that they knew or ought to have known that what they were doing was false, and they published it anyway. And there's an additional requirement in America, as I understand it, that act has to have been with the intent to damage.
Right. So, as far as I'm concerned, just not having expertise in this, and what I've sort of just generally read in reaction to this, is that what they said about Maajid Nawaz is an opinion. It's essentially akin to calling someone racist. So if I called Donald Trump racist, you couldn't disprove that, or you can't prove or disprove that someone's racist, just like you can't, So it's very difficult to say that someone knew that their opinion was wrong if it's an opinion that it's I don't know how you could possibly prove that they didn't think he was a anti-Muslim bigot, right?
Well, no. Here's the thing. I don't think Dave Rubin's case has any chance. But because I think, while I think they were actually wrong, I don't think Dave Rubin is far right. I think Dave Rubin is a useful idiot for the far right. But I think that's an easy mistake to make, given who he puts on his show and the way he behaves. So I don't think you could ever show the required malice. With the Southern Poverty Law Centre, I think it's going to be really important as to what comes out in discovery. If this case is dismissed before discovery, then it's all over, obviously. Mm-hmm. But if the case goes to discovery, it's going to be very interesting to see what the email trail and the internal discussion trail is, because there are factual errors in the SPLC's reasoning towards its conclusion that
Right.
Majid Nawaz is an anti-Muslim hate preacher. Those factual errors were pointed out to the Southern Poverty Law Centre and were pointed out by some pretty credible, relatively left-wing people. And that was in public. We don't know what's going on in private. So it does seem to, and the thing is, defamation's ongoing. Like you can publish something honest and which is honestly mistaken, and then when your error is pointed out to you, failing to correct can mean that you lose the case from that moment onwards. You're protected for before you knew, but you're not protected after.
Right.
So I think that it really is going to depend on what Majid Nawaz's lawyers dig up, and it would take a smoking gun. But I would be surprised but not shocked. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that there is a smoking gun, because there are some just outrageously untrue and bizarre elements to that reasoning, and it was pointed out to them. So I would say that Dave Rubin suing Mother Jones is hopeless. Majid Nawaz suing the Southern Poverty Law Centre is a long shot. It's a three-pointer from the back half of the court.
Right.
Right?
Well,
Which is to say, it could succeed. It could succeed, but it's going to take an unwisely candid email from someone inside the SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Centre,
right.
or an astonishingly well-reasoned letter, email from, or perhaps an astonishingly well-reasoned demolition of their reasoning, and then a truly and a response that basically says, "I don't care if I'm wrong, I'm still running it." That it would take some incriminating stuff in discovery for them to win.
Right. Well,
but
isn't it also kind of interesting to say that coming from people who claim to be free speech absolutists? Obviously, like defamation, libel, slander, those are sort of these common law exceptions to the very strong free speech laws we have in, the United States and similar countries. But pushing a very long shot case against someone, legal case against someone who you think wronged you in their words, it isn't necessarily you're not a free speech warrior necessarily if that's what you're pushing.
Oh, look, no, I disagree. I think unless someone has been very stupid, any defamation case by a public figure in the United States is going to be a long shot.
Right.
Any defamation. Yeah, unless the person has been just very stupid and confessed malice in public at a later date. Someone like Donald Trump confessing the way he confesses to things. Unless someone has been very stupid, all defamation cases against public figures in the US are going to be long shots. And as I said, I'm not a US lawyer, I'm an Australian lawyer, and my knowledge of US defamation law is almost like a negative. It's,
right.
it casts an influence on our law, so we know about it as this thing that we're comparing and contrasting ourselves with.
Right. Right.
But my impression is that this is the sort of case you would run if you were bullish. This is the sort of case that, as a lawyer, you would say to a client, you got like a 1 in 6 chance. If you're really upset about it and you're prepared to spend money on it, then it's not a ridiculous case.
So you're saying that perhaps you could justify it by saying I might lose this, but it will sort of publicize the unfairness of how I was labeled by the Southern Poverty Law Center, which I think it is true that he was very, very unfair how they characterized him. And
look, and also, and you are allowed to say this as an American lawyer, you're not allowed to say this as an Australian lawyer. But the other reason why you would run this case is I want discovery. I want access to the Southern Poverty Law Centre's internal documents. I want to know what was going on. because and in America that's a motivation for a lot of litigation. A lot of people have sued Donald Trump in order to get discovery.
Right.
And things will come out, like their donors list will come out. Now, there's arguments either way as to whether that's a good thing, but look. So my view is that Majid Nawaz, you can be a free speech, you can be an advocate for free speech, and as an advocate for free speech, you've got to take a lot on the chin and say, look, this is wrong and wrong about me, but I'm not going to sue. But there is a point at which even a free speech warrior has to say enough is enough. This meets the standard in my view. I'm going to sue. And I think what was said about Majid was sufficiently outrageous. It was also said by an organisation which has sufficient credibility. I mean, the Southern Poverty Law Centre has, and this is one of the things I find bad about this lawsuit, that it's going to play into this this demonisation of the Southern Poverty Law Centre as being a horrible hate organisation and always having been a horrible hate organisation. And Majid has argued against this, but it's nevertheless going to happen. People are going to use this, and that's wrong. Southern Poverty Law Centre has done incredibly important and good work, taking down the Ku Klux Klan, taking down the Aryan Brotherhood or Aryan Nation or whatever it's called.
Right.
They've done great work. This is a great liberal organisation that has just lost its way on this one particular issue. I think
isn't that a big tension with people who are in that sort of space of criticizing fundamentalist or conservative Islam? Is they're sort of being used to strawman the left and say the left is, ridiculous and crazy, and they'll defend people who are, like pretty awful on a lot of things. They'll while sort of blowing up while minimizing.
Absolutely. This is the question that I asked Sam Harris over and over again in various AMAs and things throughout his career, which is, how careful do liberal critics of Islam have to be that their criticisms aren't co-opted and used by the far right for nationalist, racist, and bigoted purposes? And it was really funny because the first time I asked that question and got a response from an AMA, it was a completely dismissive, this is rubbish. Anyone who reads me would know that I'm not like that. Go away. And then in Islam and the Future of Tolerance, he answers that question in the audio addendum with a conversation between him and Majid at the end. And Sam takes it really seriously, as does Majid. Now, I mean, he said all the things you would want him to say. I still think, going back to your comment earlier, that he's not outraged enough when this happens.
But isn't there...
and
there is this...
Sorry, I was going to say...
Go ahead.
I was going to say, his outrage against Trump has helped there, and his friendship with Majid has helped there. But I still think Sam, in my view, needs to get angrier about the way his memes are co-opted by anti-Muslim bigots.
Well,
anyway, go on.
There's this use of, like I went to one of these liberal left-wing liberal arts colleges. So I understand what, a lot of the stuff, like I knew about, how I was oppressing people by just existing back in 2007, 2010, I was fully educated on that. And I think there is a lot of ridiculousness on the left. Like, we just had this gay pride parade that was protested by people who are on the far left, who are concerned that they had the NYPD's gay cops were marching in the parade, and they were so upset about that they protested it. And I saw, if you saw, there was a someone with an Israeli, or not Israeli, a Star of David gay pride flag was kicked out of a gay pride event in Chicago. And I guess, which is just outright. Well, and there are a lot about, like, I guess the other thing, it's been a lot of publicity, was the Evergreen State College situation. And you listen to the students, and their arguments are terrible, and what they're doing is complete nonsense. But I just want to get to my point.
Sure.
while that all of that is true, I think there is this blowing that out of proportion and acting like a few anarchist college kids and skateboard punks or whatever. That is the left, and that represents the full spectrum of the left. It represents people from like Hillary Clinton, the Democratic Party, and then like I was at the Women's March in D.C. I've been to a bunch of anti-Trump events, protests of the Muslim ban, and you go to these events and you're like, wow, these are like middle-class women. This is like
look, the analogy I use. And this is where I disagree with you a bit, because I don't think the crazies are a minority. The crazies are a large group. But the analogy I use is we have a baby in the bathwater problem. There is a lot of dirty bathwater, and it's currently drowning Evergreen College. But in that bath, there is a left-wing baby that is worth saving. And even concepts like privilege, which get overused as a baseball bat to beat white men and white women over the head until they shut up. That baseball bat actually had a function, and it wasn't as a baseball bat. It was a way of saying, as a white. I mean, the classic example I always tell is, I was in America and I was at a conference and I'd met a black guy and we were having lunch, and he was from Nigeria. He wasn't even African American. He was at an international conference. But he'd spent a lot of time in America. And I get up and say, look, you pay the check, because we had to get somewhere quickly. You pay the check. I'll pay the check. You wave the taxi down. And he looked at me strangely and just did it. And I went outside after having paid the check, and he still didn't have a taxi. And I sort of look at him and go, what, dude? And so I waved a taxi down. And only as I'm getting in the taxi did I realize what had just happened. Now, that's a trivial example, but it is an example of privilege. I had never had to realize, I was blind to the fact that it is really hard for a Nigerian guy who was better dressed than me and who could have bought and sold me 10 times over, is going to have trouble getting a taxi in Manhattan, whereas I can raise my hand and I'll get one.
Right.
Now, that's a trivial example. But it then turns into quite serious examples. Like, I get pulled over by the police and I find it an inconvenience. Someone with black skin gets pulled over the police and it could be the end of their life, and they are terrified.
Oh, well, there's a lot of people out there, on the center right, and these people who are these rational, skeptic, atheist type guys. And a lot of it's like white men. And they think there's no such thing as white privilege or male privilege or straight privilege. And that's insane. It's insane. Like, if you live in the United States, you have to understand that the African-American population of the United States is at a tremendous structural disadvantage, and there's this history that goes into everything that happens, and to not be sensitive, of racism and just the historical realities of our country, So I was going to say, the useful bit of white privilege is the bit about the blind spot, is the bit about the fact that a whole lot of disadvantages that black people and women suffer, white people and men don't see because we've never had to see it. We have to have our eyes open to it. It's actually, it's almost a sympathetic thing. It's like, look, dude, you don't get how bad this is. Let me show you. It's not your fault for not seeing how bad it is, because you've never had to confront it the way the subjected group has. But it doesn't necessarily mean, privilege doesn't mean you're evil. There's an example, I think it was Chris Rock or some American comedian was taking photos every time he got pulled over of the police car's blue lights in the back window of his car, because he just kept getting pulled over in his neighborhood because he lived in a rich white neighborhood. And then one day he's pulled over by a cop, and the cop sees who it is and just looks at him and says, have you posted it yet? and Chris Rock says, what? He said, I'm a fan. I can't believe I've done this. I've been laughing about this and how terrible it is, and now I do it. And he says, I can't tell you why I stopped you. He said, like, I didn't know it was a black person driving the car. It was just something about this car that made me suspicious, so I stopped it. And like, guess what it was? But he wasn't, black person, I'm going to stop this. It was, something's not right here. You know what I mean?
And so it was unconscious. Now that's bad, but it's like you look at the poor cop and think, you weren't even aware of your own unconscious reaction until a very embarrassing.
Well,
and that's why privilege is useful, because privilege is a useful concept because it says to people, look, there's all these assumptions we've been brought up with that we're not examining, and we need to examine them. And that's where that concept is really useful. But then it gets turned by the so-called social justice warriors. I hate that term because there's nothing wrong with social justice. But the campus postmodernist crazies turn it into, if you're white, you can't talk about the black experience. If you're white, you don't get a vote in these things. Well, no. If you're white, you might want to listen to black people a little more closely before you shoot your mouth off, because they're going to have experiences that you haven't had, and they're going to see things you might miss. But that doesn't mean you should shut up, and that doesn't mean you should be discounted.
Right. Well, it's interesting, like I've lived in a black neighborhood, I guess, going on 5 years now. And I have black people in my family. My best friend growing up was black, so like I've always talked to black folk about this sort of stuff. And I've never gotten the shut up because you're white response to all this stuff. And I think if you...
But you might have got that on campus.
Yeah, well, I think if you're willing to listen to people and meet them at their level and talk to them openly and honestly, and you have a sensitivity to where they're coming from, I think a lot of this sort of stuff is, it's really overblown. Like living in my neighborhood, I've had more people come up to me and just start talking to me about how great it is that white people live in their neighborhood now. But I've had people who are like, I'm angry that you've moved here and you're different from me. And it's like, there's this idea that there's this huge reverse racism towards white people and this huge animosity towards white people. The amount of not racism I feel towards me being white in my neighborhood, because I guess like the ultimate truth people want to get to is that your race doesn't matter at all. Race isn't a thing. It's a non-issue. It's your skin color. It's a little bit of what you look like, but it means nothing. And what you have to do is treat people as individuals, not a woman, a black person. But I think there is this, sort of ridiculous backlash to a lot of those things that people use the campus left version of it to stifle like legitimate conversations that could go on. And when it comes to the idea of white privilege, therefore, that's a lot of times where it sort of gets out of hand, because you can't say a lot of cops are racist, which is 100% true. I see cops being racist a lot. That doesn't mean that you should necessarily implement XYZ policy when it comes to police. Like I saw the Women's March Twitter account said tweeted out an article saying we should get rid of the police. And and I live in a neighborhood where we don't have a lot of crime, but we have much more crime than you would see in any European city or a lot of places in America. And if you walked into my neighborhood and you said, let's get rid of the police to anyone, you'd be laughed at.
Well, look, but the thing about there's something I should say about Australia after this, but the thing about the distrust of police in black communities is that it links in with all that failed state literature, which basically says that if you, in countries where the state has failed and you can't rely on the police, you revert back to a tribe. It is rational, and people do, because it is rational, revert back to a pre-modern way of resolving disputes, which is that, in order to survive, you either have to be plausibly capable of violence or be well known to be associated with people who are plausibly capable of violence. And it becomes a gang mentality, and this happens anywhere the state breaks down. Hell, and in some ways, the TV show The Walking Dead is about the way in which humans revert to that sort of behaviour. The problem with that is, it's not just if a state fails; it's if you don't feel you can rely on the police. And right. if you as a community don't trust the police, then you are going to have to revert to this sort of violence-based, gang-based, performative violence, pre-modern way of protecting yourself. And the problem with these communities is that in many of those communities, the black population don't trust the police for good reason, because the police are untrustworthy. And in other communities, the black people don't trust the police because the police used to be untrustworthy and the whole thing hasn't filtered through yet. So that the solution to these problems is not abolishing the police. The solution to these problems is police outreach, community policing, recruiting
exactly.
from the community.
Well, people talk about community policing. I think that's a huge issue. You look at, if the rest of the United States had the same police shooting rate as the NYPD does, it would be a massive reduction. The NYPD shoot many fewer people than the St. Louis Police Department or New Orleans Police Department.
And a large part of that is also because of training, that a lot of these police forces aren't well trained. I should just say something, which is that I'm criticizing sort of racism in America, and I come from a country which has its own racism problems. So, I don't want to sound holier than thou. The only successful genocide of a native people in modern times was in Australia. We killed all the Tasmanian. Well, we're now in a situation where there's the only existing Tasmanian Aboriginals are 1/32 or something. This is a country that has a pretty horrific history with racism. We had an explicitly racist immigration policy right up until the 1950s, and an implicitly racist one, well into up to the 1970s. So, everyone. I just should say that I don't want to sound like I'm holier than thou criticizing your country.
It's interesting as an American going to other countries and seeing how they view race and nationality and all these different things. It's in some ways it's better, in some ways it's worse when you go to Western Europe, because Australia has a different set of history. I mean, the really good example, and Josh Zepps, who I'm a big fan of, was talking about the N-word, and I there's this really interesting thing, which is, I understand why Americans are so, white Americans are so reluctant to use the N-word. I don't have that feeling about that word because I don't come from that history. But right. There are words for Australian Aboriginals that it would be very hard pressed for you to get me to say. Like if you said, for Christ's sake, Ben, say the N-word, I would say N-I-G-G-R. And I would be like, my concern would be how other people react. It wouldn't hurt inside me. But there are words for Aboriginals who would actually hurt me to say, in part because as a child growing up in a relatively racist part of Australia, white people used to tell Aboriginal jokes using these words. And, there's a certain amount of shame that I have laughed at those jokes as a young man. And, each country has its own, slightly different, but all based in human xenophobia. So we never had slavery in Australia. On the other hand, we stole Aboriginal children and brought them up. If an Aboriginal woman had a child with a white man, the child was ipso facto taken away from her. And we were doing that into the 1960s. So, it is, the last massacre of Aboriginals by Australians was in the early part of the 20th century. So every country has its dark history. I suppose I just wanted to make that point, but it's different. In Australia, if a black African American is in Australia, they're generally seen as a curiosity rather than a threat because there's so few of them. Whereas our racism is towards Asians and subcontinentals and Aborigines, and everyone's got a slight variety of slightly different variety of the same shittiness. Oh, I mean, I noticed that. I grew up in Tucson, Arizona, and obviously we had a very low black population, but there is this racism towards the Native Americans.
Yes.
Who is a reservation south of Tucson, and there is a view of what Native Americans are like, and a lack of sympathy for Native American people. And it's also true for Mexican, or Latino people in Tucson. And there is a sort of a segregation that is incredibly palpable in a place like Tucson. You know, it's like the residential segregation is amazing. You know, like I grew up in Tucson. I lived there from age 8 to 18. I have been to the Mexican American area of Tucson, I think once, one time in my life, you know, because there's just like this there's just incredible, this is where Mexicans live, this is where white people live. And
some of that is deliberate because of the practice of redlining historically, and you know, the whole saying of the wrong side of the tracks in America comes from the idea that, you know, on the other side of the railway tracks was where the non-whites were.
Yeah, and I mean, and this goes to a lot of the way people talk about, you know, crime, right? Because if you are denied economic opportunities and you are sort of in society viewed as, we're not going to respect your intellect, we're not going to respect your humanity, people are going to see their sort of who they are through oftentimes, you know, their ability to command respect in a, you know, a machismo way, rather than, you know, you know, my job gives me respect, you know, something like that, you know, my standing in the community gives me respect, and, you know, my feeling of self-worth comes from my respect in the community. And when you sort of marginalize people and they don't feel like they have the hope of being respected in that way, it tends to sort of, it's corrosive to the, you know, the community, and I think it oftentimes leads to crime. And, you know, the sort of viewing of people as like, your community is at fault because you are not thriving as much as another community. That can become, you know, it's the sort of...
The thing that drives me nuts is the constant attack on the black community for having, you know, fatherless households. Now, there's two things about that. The white community now, of all people, Charles Murray has done a lot of work pointing this out, a very problematic figure, but on this point he's made a good point, which is that the sort of fractures that the way in which the white working class family in America is falling apart is kind of like a delayed version of what happened to the black working class family. But a large part of why it happened to black people earlier and why it happened to black people faster, a large part of why there's so many fatherless families is the fathers are in jail, and they're not in jail for violent offences. They're in jail for possession of weed or not paying their parking fines or whatever, because of the criminalisation of, you know, and the concentration on those things. So that, you know, there's a huge amount of blaming oppressed communities for problems that the majority community actually helped create, in my view.
Yeah, and I think I'm on both sides of the sort of divide. I mean, what you need is more of a sensitivity towards where other people are coming from, and I think, and also just more of a, let's not just focus on the negative aspects of all these different people and their community. More focus on where can you find successes, and how can you improve the lives of people. And
absolutely. And sorry, here's a point. Why are we complaining about how, you know, problematic or difficult African American men are supposed to be? There's one point that doesn't get talked about nearly enough, which is how badass African American women are. I mean, you know, they have held their community together while their men have been in jail, and they've held it together remarkably well. You know, it's sort of one of the unsung stories that has always struck me when I've looked into this. You know, that's a community that's done enormous that has done an enormous job in dealing with a very difficult circumstance.
Well, I think you can certainly look at the 2016 election, and you could say black women are the most sensible voting population.
Yeah. Everyone thinks that the iconic Hillary voter is a you know, sort of mid-40s white professional woman. No, it's a black single mother struggling to get her master's degree. You know, that was her base. Look, I think that's absolutely right. You should talking about the segregation of different communities. I just have to tell this story. I went to visit, when I was in America, I went to visit the Gettysburg battlefield, and I stayed at a nearby town called Hanover. And I had always thought I didn't like Mexican food because in those days, Mexican food in Australia was terrible. And I sort of ate some Mexican food in America and discovered what real Mexican food tastes like. So I'm in Hanover and I play GPS roulette and just basically say to the GPS, take me to the nearest Mexican food place. And suddenly I'm only a few blocks, maybe more than a few blocks, but not very far from where I was staying in this lovely town. And suddenly there's potholes in the road and it's a slightly dodgy area. I didn't feel frightened, but I felt a bit, sort of, oh, well, what's this part of town? And, and I got out and I got into this restaurant where only the manager spoke English. It was the best Mexican food I'd ever had. And I got a huge amount of change out of a $20 bill for a large meal for a couple of people. And while I'm there, I realized this is where every cleaner in this town eats. The massive segregation in America where, and also the concern.
What did you just say? What did you just say?
No, I was jokingly. What I said was, it appeared that, the Hispanic community in this town lived an entirely different life from the white community.
Right. Yeah.
So I then made what might have sounded like a racist joke. We said, "My God, is this where every cleaner in this town eats?" Which was me.
Okay.
Joking. It was one of those problems where you make a joke about racism and it can sound like a racist joke. So perhaps
I thought you said a word that was not cleaner.
All right. Oh my goodness. Oh, right. Okay. Yes. No, I did not say that word.
Yeah.
I absolutely did not say that word, and I'm mortified yes, I was making a comment about the segregation of types of work, and this was a community where I was sort of sitting there thinking the only Hispanic people I've seen in this town have been service.
Yeah, well,
jobs.
I mean that's
and this is a part of the town where the people. This was clearly a restaurant that was primarily for Spanish-speaking people because the only staff member in this restaurant who spoke English was the manager.
Right.
And it was incredibly cheap, which was enormously surprising to me. And it was also in a part of town where it appeared that they hadn't fixed potholes in the road in 5 years. And this was a sort of a lovely, sort of semi-rural town in Pennsylvania. And it taught me how segregated. It was an example of what you were talking about how segregated the living circumstances of the different ethnicities in America can be.
Yeah, no, that's certainly true. I mean, you look at the election, like the geographic divide is a lot of the problem. But like a lot of the reason that people who are Trump voters and people who are Hillary voters just they can't really see eye to eye because they live lives that are totally different because they live in different places.
This is one of the things that's quite exceptional about America, and I don't think Americans realize this about their country, which is that America is actually a lot less urbanized than a lot of the countries it compares itself to.
Right.
So, for instance, Australia, I think it's 9 out of 10 Australians live in a city.
Right.
8 out of 10 of us live in 3 cities. You think of Australia as Crocodile Dundee, and yes, there are huge cattle stations. You'd call them cattle ranches and all that sort of stuff. But the majority of us live in cities or suburbs. That's not true in America. America has an incredibly large rural and semi-rural population, and it has a much larger rural and semi-rural population than Canada does, or most European countries do, certainly more than Australia. And I think that has a fair bit to do with your divide, because you just don't live near each other.
Well,
you know what I mean?
Well, I live in Brooklyn.
Conservatives and liberals.
Yeah,
Yes.
I don't know a Trump voter. I mean, I guess if I'm in high school, I could look at my high school friends. Some of them must have voted for Trump, but people I talked to, not one person supported Trump. In my family, I think my racist uncle voted for Gary Johnson. That's the closest I can get.
Yes.
And there are a lot of people, who live in, Kentucky or even rural New York, and everyone they know voted for Trump. and it's you go to these small towns and it's a completely different lifestyle. And versus New York, where I'm constantly in contact with all these different kinds of people, and there's but I'm also not in contact with Trump voters at all. So it's a geographic divide that we can't really bridge, and we can't really talk to each other because we live, we're living a different existence in so many ways.
Yeah, it's just that little interesting fact that about America that I think everyone talks about America being an outlier amongst industrialized OECD nations, or even Anglophile nations, English-speaking nations. It's an outlier,
right.
In terms of its gun policy, in terms of its lack of a comprehensive welfare safety net, but another big part of it is just this rural-urban divide. I mean, I think the closest might be England, but English rural is kind of different from American rural. So I'm not quite sure what to make of that point, but it's one of those divides that really seems to matter, because in Australia, conservatives and what Americans would call liberals tend to live a lot closer together than in the US. I mean, yes, there are still sort of markedly conservative suburbs and markedly liberal suburbs. We don't have conservative and liberal states,
Yeah, well,
Queensland and Tasmania, which are Florida and Alabama respectively, have both had Labor governments, in recent years. So it just seems to be there's just so much more polarization. But I suppose we're not solving a problem. We're just lamenting it at the moment. The one topic we had left was atheism and how it's become the relationship between the atheism and the alt-right.
Yeah,
which is something that worries me.
Well, I'm not somebody. I mean, I'm an atheist. I've always been one. I'm not at all. I'm pretty disconnected from religion, but I've never sort of thought of myself as like an atheist politically in any way. But I notice that people who do, and people who sort of bill themselves as atheists and skeptics or whatever, I find that to be kind of a pretentious way to refer to yourself. But where they've gone politically in the last 2 years, I think just as an outsider watching it, it's remarkable. You have people who are thought of as atheist skeptic types, and it seems like to me that their fan base are Trump supporters basically, and it's a lot of these people are these sort of nerdy alt-right, or alt-light at least type people who have some beliefs that are crazy.
Look, let me just say, I would consider myself a new atheist. I'm prepared to lie down in that chalk outline.
Right.
I am someone who read Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion when it came out and absolutely loved it. And it was the quotes from Sam Harris in there were incredibly intriguing, and I devoured The End of Faith and Letter to a Christian Nation and absolutely loved those two books. And Dennett's Breaking the Spell was an incredibly good book, although less about religion and more because it introduced me to David Dennett, who's just fascinating. And then I was a huge fan of Christopher Hitchens.
Right.
Even when I disagreed with him, and I disagreed with him on the Iraq War, although I think Hitch put the best argument for the Iraq War I'd ever heard. And in many ways, my view on the Iraq War is almost like a conversation with Hitch, because I think he put the best case. It was a better case than the Bush administration themselves put. And I still think it's wrong, but it's a little bit like.
Well, he was a little
bit like Sam talking about the people who want a Muslim ban. I'm perhaps maybe too sympathetic to Hitch's argument, but I can see why Hitch supported the Iraq War. I think he was wrong. My view is that everything he wanted to achieve was never going to be achieved by George W. Bush. My view is he went to war with the wrong president. That something had to be done about Saddam, but there was no reason to do it then. It was a distraction from Afghanistan, and there was no reason to do. And you should have done it with a global global coalition, and you should have done it with a better plan for putting the place back together. And you should have done it with much more internal support, and maybe done it 10 years later. But because I think I agree with Hitch that that people who say Saddam was a bad guy are completely misunderstanding how bad Saddam Hussein was.
I think we're a little bit off topic here.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Sorry. But so anyway, I would, but I'm sort of doing that to give my credentials as saying that I'm a dyed-in-the-wool new atheist, and I am concerned about the way in which, not so much the headline figures. I mean, Dawkins is appalled by Trump and is appalled by UKIP and he's appalled by Brexit.
He strikes me as someone who's a liberal or a left-winger. Whatever. Yeah. That whole terminology debate is mind-numbing. But yeah,
Dawkins is an Enlightenment fundamentalist. He doesn't like Islam for the same reason he doesn't like Christianity. And if Christians were as conservative and as nutty as Muslims are at this point as a lot of Muslims are at this point in their history, then he'd be railing against, and he has railed against Christians just as hard. He also has a tin ear. Everyone talks about, you talk about Sam being politically naive. Sam is a political connoisseur compared to Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins has this astonishing ability to ram his foot in his mouth. But it's sort of the second tier figures, the Michael Shermers and the
oh my god
and those people.
Yeah, he is insufferable. Insufferable guy. Oh my.
Yeah, God. I agree with you there. And you've got to remember, there was this split in the skeptic community a few years back where I think the best example is the way in which there were a bunch of women skeptics who were very much part of the skeptic community, but who began saying, look, guys, we have this problem with misogyny within our community. We have this problem with sexual harassment at conferences. And they got drowned out by this flood of misogyny. And it kind of, the skeptic community kind of ended up, there was a couple of other, also some unfortunate incidents, and Richard Dawkins to some extent has some blame in this because of one incident that I won't go into unless you ask me to, but the kind of that liberal part, small L liberal part of the skeptic community kind of went away. It kind of got driven out. So we are to some extent, you are to some extent seeing the unintended or unforeseen consequence of a battle that was fought primarily over sexism about 5 or 10 years ago. And have a look at sort of the Rebecca Watson versus Richard Dawkins mess, which I think is an example of how the skeptic community kind of went wrong. And I have a complex view about that. I think there's wrong on both sides in that particular contretemps, but it's a nice it's a nice example.
Well, I guess what you're
and
go ahead.
No, so to some extent, it's sort of historically contingent that the people who are most associated with the brand are the people who won a fight 5 or 7 years ago over a slightly different issue. But that slightly different issue is connected. I mean, it's the sort of MRA, men's rights, anti-feminist thing, which is very much tied up in, the Sargon of our cards and those sort of atheist YouTubers.
Yeah, well, I mean, you look at YouTube is in and of itself its own sort of, it's a cesspool of just right-wing nutcases but I guess that there is this thing of these people who are very obsessive sort of nerds, basically, right? The people who are really obsessed with specific ideas like that, a lot of them tend to be, they're not sort of part of like a group. They're sort of really like idealistically committed to groups like that. A lot of them tend to be men who are, a little bit on the spectrum, let's say, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, I that's both a good and a bad thing. People on the spectrum who have no social lives often achieve great things. They also often kind of tend to sort of go into a whirlpool down the drain. So it's a 50-50 proposition.
Right, right.
And some are, and look,
I think
I'm increasingly. Sorry,
go ahead.
Look, I'm increasingly coming to the view that actually, although it appears to be a separate or an only tangentially related issue, misogyny actually is a really important, maybe not the cause, but is a really important marker in all of this. It just keeps popping up. So you look at the one thing that it was common between, right-wing shooters and Islamic fundamentalists who become terrorists. The one common thing about them, not all of them, but most of them, the one really common marker is domestic violence.
Oh yeah.
Against partners. There really is there's something there's a feminist common denominator in this, a misogynist common denominator in this, which to some extent has been concealed by the fact that modern feminism, and again, I'm talking about campus feminism, has gone a bit nuts, has gone a bit crazy. I mean, again, intersectionality is one of these baby in the bathwater ideas where it actually, at the bottom of it, there's a good point that's been horribly misused. But so you can start a critique of, you can start with a critique of feminism that is actually quite reasonable, and end up in what I recently discovered on Reddit as a thing called the red pill. Yeah, where I began reading that thinking it was a parody of misogyny. And,
oh my God!
And it took me a while to realize it was serious.
It's all like the whole issue of misogyny and the sort of anti-feminist core of a lot of these regressive movements on the right. These really retrograde, reactionary bullshit. I think you're totally right about saying that's a common denominator in them. And
because misogyny is also at the center of a lot of what is wrong with Islam. Misogyny is actually one of these things that is, it's the key thing that's wrong. That and homophobia is the key thing that's wrong with conservative Islam. It's a massive part of radical Islam. It's a massive part of it's a huge part of the alt-right. It's the one thing they all agree on is they hate women. They just hate them in different ways.
I would go a step further and say, if you want to find a group of men who don't have women around them, you're essentially just a recipe for just uncontrolled, like egging people on to greater and greater acts of debauchery and violence. It's like, this is sort of stereotypical, I guess, but it's not true across the board. But if you have like a sports team where there's not women, they tend to get up to like antics that are like, or a fraternity, right? Those types, when there isn't a gender sort of parity or a listening to women, I think that's where you tend to sort of, a lot of the sort of social dynamics become very, very negative. But what I've sort of noticed is that in the 2016 election, I just despairing about this, is that when you point out sexism or to men, it almost makes it worse.
Yeah, and there was the whole Bernie bro phenomenon, which was slightly, well, actually, I don't think it was it would be overblown to say all Bernie supporters were Bernie bros. Oh yeah, but the Bernie bro phenomenon was real.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, there was real sexism. I don't for a moment say that Bernie himself has a sexist bone in his body, or like, he's no more sexist than any other man, which is to say, we've all imbibed sexism, but Bernie would be amongst the most assiduous in attempting to expunge his own unconscious sexism. But some of his supporters were just disturbing.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I was a big Hillary supporter during on Twitter, and I definitely sort of noticed that. And but it's one of those things where you feel like if you point out sexism to someone, you're being sexist, they almost double down into it, and it's very hard to talk about that issue with a lot of men, because they sort of put you in that box, like, oh, you're an awful social justice warrior feminist, and you can't even have a conversation about it. And it's you almost just feel.
This is where I think we need. Yeah, I agree with you. But this is where I think we need a new word for the concept that was originally called privilege. We need a new word for innocent, unconscious sexism and racism. We need a new word for, or I need a way of dealing with people who say and do things that are sexually or racially discriminatory without realizing that's what they're doing. And it's funny because this is where I think a lot of I do have a disagreement with a lot of feminists, because a lot of feminists, and especially a lot of young feminists, I mean, I'm now in my 40s, a lot of 20-year-old feminists I say this to, say, look, dude, it's 2017. If they haven't worked it out by now, then they deserve what they get. And maybe I'm just too old, but I have this view that when people, we need a way to point out to people that they're being unintentionally sexist. We need to come up with a language that where you can say, when someone is making a criticism of Hillary, and you can say, but hold on a second, here's this male politician who did exactly the same thing, and he was never criticized in this way. That doesn't get heard as you are being a sexist arsehole, but instead some way of saying that where it's heard as you have unintentionally and innocently misinterpreted a situation, and you maybe need to check yourself. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, well, I think that there needs to be a different sort of rhetoric from people. Like, there's this whole idea of being woke versus being not woke.
And but that also has become a cliche of itself.
Oh, for sure.
Being woke doesn't mean that I will never disagree with a woman. All right? Being woke means that I will disagree with a woman respectfully. Being woke means that when I'm having an argument with a woman, I will stop and think, hold on a second, have I been talking more than she has? You know, or am I using my loud voice to shut her up? Or have I just dismissed a point primarily because I've never experienced this and she has? But woke doesn't mean that when I hear a really crap argument, I don't say, dude, right, that's a crap argument.
Well, I think that there needs to be more of a framing that's less challenging to people, and more talking about how we want people to be treated as individuals and treat them fairly. And just think about if you're treating people fairly in you know, based on their gender, their race, their sexual orientation, et cetera, and just think about it.
And also, maybe the answer is also doing it as a question. You know, do you think, like, there is this, so there is this problem with women's voices. So, Hillary gets called shrill.
Right.
But there are lots and lots of male speakers who give speeches the way Hillary does because they're not natural speakers, who don't get called shrill. They get called kind of average white male speakers. And so to give you a good example, I've been unimpressed by Kamala Harris. I've been unimpressed by her speeches. I've been unimpressed by her speaking style. I've been unimpressed by her answers to interview questions. Mm-hmm. And I said this, and someone on Twitter said to me, is that because she's a woman? And I immediately got my back up, like, hold on a second. I'm a massive Hillary supporter. I'm a big Elizabeth Warren supporter. But it is actually, but I sort of stopped and thought, well, no, maybe that's, maybe I just need to check that. Is it that there's something about her voice, and because she's a woman, I don't find I find her voice irritating. Is there something there? And I think it's entirely legitimate to make people stop and think. I've still come to the conclusion that I'm not that impressed with Kamala Harris, but
yeah. Well, there's this idea
I think there's got to be a way to.
Well, this whole demonization of identity politics and talking about that as this huge threat to our society. And I think what people have to realize is that identity politics is always going to be a part of politics. And it's always a consideration. Like, are you being sexist? It's always going to be a consideration in every workplace, in every country, forever. It's never going to be solved.
There's this great there's this great guy on Twitter who's a black guy who was a Hillary Clinton supporter, and I can't remember his name. But he constantly says, you know, when white liberal Democrats say they want to get away from identity politics, what they're really meaning is they want to ignore black people. And you know, there's identity politics and there's identity politics. There's the identity politics that says your identity is everything, and I think it's just nuts. Right. And there's the ridiculous identity politics, you know, whereas I identify as a queer, gender fluid attack helicopter. And that's all worth ridiculing. But behind that, there's a real, you know, I need to say, by having said that, I absolutely think trans rights are a real issue, and I think there are some real problems there. There are some real problems there with the way people are treated. But you know, that there is also a fact that black people and gay people and trans people in America and in Australia lead different lives with different problems that white people don't see and don't notice, and that those problems need to be addressed.
Right. Well,
and also it's madness because the Democratic Party, without black voters, the Democratic Party would be you know, sort of only slightly larger than the Green Party. Sorry, that's an exaggeration, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. No, that's the base of the Democratic Party. But I think there's this whole idea that like identity politics is bad, and essentially, what all these issues are going to come up in society, and inevitably, and they can be dealt with in a thoughtful, intelligent, fact-based way, and a way that listens to people on both sides of these sort of divides, and can sort of be had in a more calm way, and doesn't.
I absolutely agree, but the way they're dealt with on campus is, and you know that. And you know, you look into her background in other ways, and she was quite an intelligent, quite an accomplished Yale student. But that black girl screaming at Christos, what's his name?
Christakis.
The master. Yes, Christakis, the master of Silliman College. That was appalling. It was because it wasn't that she disliked what he was saying. It was that she was offended that he would say it at all. She was offended because all he was saying was, I don't think I'm being, and he was being incredibly reasonable. He's like, I don't think I'm being racist, but maybe I am. So let's talk about that. He was modeling exactly what you would want, which is, I don't accept your argument, but that may be because I don't understand your argument. So let's talk about it.
Yeah.
And her response was to scream him down. And the same thing happened to Brett, what's his name, at Evergreen College.
Weinstein, yeah.
Weinstein.
I guess my one insight on that, and just my sort of as an observer of that at my college, is that I think a lot of these people, there's a divide in all these colleges, especially these very elite colleges, between the very privileged, rich, white kids who go there, who are...
Yes.
Who have access to a certain lifestyle that very few adults in America have access to. And they've lived a life that it just feels like people who interact with them are very put off by them, because who are normal kids. And a lot of the kids who are black and Hispanic and Asian are much more normal. They're much more middle class. And they come to these colleges and they see these people and they're like, you're a rich douchebag. I don't like you, and you have no idea what you're doing, and you're just offensive to me because you're a rich asshole. And you know, a lot of these kids, it's like I'm just frustrated that I'm living. It can be frustrating living with people who have this sort of social class that they haven't earned, and are, you know, they're very young and they're not really understanding how to be a normal person. And they're surrounding you, and you're like, these people are such dicks. And and I'm coming from like normal America, and I'm seeing these people who are so full of themselves, and they're East Coast elites who are annoying me. And I think that I think a lot of people, they come to that and they're like, they're upset, and it's a culture shock. it's a culture shock, and they realize how America is an incredibly divided place in a way they didn't really understand. And it can be really traumatizing for people to experience that, especially when they're 18 or 19 and they're in these like very incestuous small communities in these colleges. And it doesn't explain how the colleges handle it. And it's not an excuse for the behavior, but I think that is driving a lot of the anger of people. And
have you? Sorry, go on.
Oh, go ahead.
Have you seen the Netflix series, not the movie, but the Netflix series, Dear White People?
No.
Not only would I urge you to watch it, I would people listening to us, and it's a long spectrum from sort of lefties to right wingers. I would actually urge the right wing people who were appalled by the title of that series and who were appalled by the by the perception that it was a social justice warrior propaganda series. I'd actually urge them to watch it, and it is a masterpiece because it's actually a true piece of art because it tells both sides. There's one scene. I'm giving it away here, so spoilers. People want to jump ahead at 5 minutes, then please do. But there's one scene where there's this black guy who's got a white friend, and the white friend, and they're clearly really good friends. And he's a very privileged white friend, but he's a clearly very privileged friend. And they get drunk and they go to a party, and there's a rap song on, and the white friend says the N-word, singing along to the rap song. And the black guy just says, dude, just don't. Like, friendly way, just don't. Okay. And there's a lot of tension on campus about a whole lot of other issues because it's, they've had their version of the Yale Halloween thing.
Yeah.
And they get into an argument. And the white guy says, look, and here I am going to say the N-word, but he says, look, I'm on your side. You're my friend. I've turned up to all these protests with you. I'm friend. And I still don't get to say the word nigger when I'm singing along to a rap song. And the black guy says, no, you don't. And there's this argument and because they're drunk, it turns into a fight. And the campus police turn up. And the campus police walk in and they say to the black guy, not the white guy, the black guy, are you a student here? Show me your ID. And the white guy is going, cool it. Yes, he's a student here. It's fine. It's absolutely fine. And the black guy who's drunk, and he's saying, why are you asking me? Why aren't you asking him? When you walked in, we were both fighting on the floor. And he said, I'm asking you, are you? And then the cop pulls a gun on the black guy and says, show me your ID. And he shows him his ID, and like everyone just goes quiet. And the show doesn't say it. What's beautiful about the artistry is the show doesn't say it, but what you're saying in your head is, and dude, that's why you don't get to say nigger.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean? It was a beautiful moment because it said, like, yeah, okay, you've got a pretty good ally card, we think you're a good guy, but if you think it's unfair that you don't get to say this word, guess what? There's a whole lot of other. I think it's unfair that when you and I are wrestling on the floor in a room we're both entitled to be in, I'm the one who gets the gun in my face and you don't.
Right. Yeah.
That was a fantastic scene. But what was good is that it was really sympathetic to right up until that point, I'm sitting there thinking, God, I can kind of understand how the white guy feels. I mean, he's a good guy.
Yeah. Well, it's never as cut and dry as the anti-social justice warriors or the worst of the campus sort of leftist people are going to portray things, and there isn't like a black and white simple solution to any of these issues. It's always just working out case by case. I mean, I would say if you're like looking, people are looking for a good sort of discussion of like the campus issues from more of the right or center right perspective. I think there's a great Glenn Lowry has this great interview show he does.
Yes. Glenn Lowry's podcast with Sam Harris is really good for two reasons, actually, because Sam begins by doing this disclaimer where he says, look, it is entirely possible that I don't have the experience that black people have. You know, I'm going to not understand things, and Glenn, I want you to pull me up. And then Lowry says to him, look, does this long disclaimer, and Lowry says to him in this kind of slightly smarmy center-right way, look, it's really terrible that we live in a world where you have to say that. But then later on, Sam does the discourse version of me saying to my black friend, can you wave down the cab? He completely misses, I can't remember what it is, but he completely misses what should be an obvious point. And Lowry pulls him up and shows him what he's missed. And it's sort of the whole podcast is actually a really good model of how the privilege discourse should work, which is that privilege is about blind spots. It's about acknowledging, there's stuff that I just miss because I'm not subjected to it. When Lowry pulled him up, Lowry didn't say, shut up, you don't understand, white boy. Lowry said, yeah, but Sam, you have to understand that a kid growing up in this environment can't trust the police, and the only way he can, because it was about violence. It was like the only way that, the only way this kid can survive and not be picked on is to actually demonstrate his prowess, which maybe means picking on someone else.
Right. Well,
he was talking about the complete.
Yeah, but I was just what I was saying. His Glenn Lowry's discussions with John McWhorter, I think both of them are just very, you compare them to the people that Rubin has on his show.
Yes.
They're both on college campuses, and they're brilliant men. They're brilliant. And they're experts in their field. They're scholars in their field that are, I'm not like able to read, economics papers, but they're at the top of their fields, and they're very, they listen to both sides, and they criticize a lot of this campus left stuff, but I think they do it in a much more respectful, serious, fact-based way. And if you're like looking for that, I would say those are the people to look at. But we're verging on like 2 hours and change here, so I think I'm.
All right, not a problem.
Wrap it up.
The only thing I wanted to add, Alex, was that one of the problems with atheism as an identity is that atheism is not a thing; it's the absence of a thing.
Oh, exactly.
And so when I tell you I'm an atheist, that means you could assume that I'm a liberal Enlightenment humanist, because most Western atheists are. But I could also be a Nazi, because there were atheist Nazis. Now, most Nazis were Catholics or Protestants, but there were atheist Nazis. I could be a communist. I could be a crazy New Age crystal believer. It's telling you what I'm not rather than telling you what I am. Which is why I'm a fan of talking about the humanist community, because humanism is a commitment to something. And then it's very hard to say I'm a humanist and I think all Muslims are animals. You know what I mean? Yeah. Because they're humans and I can't. I think part of the problem with the atheist identity is that it was sort of Sam himself did this speech where he said, he doesn't like calling himself an atheist because it's a term we shouldn't need. It's sort of like, non-believer in unicorns. We shouldn't actually need a term for someone who doesn't believe in theism, because theism shouldn't be a thing.
Right.
But because theism, especially under the Bush administration, was so powerful and so pernicious, you needed to coalesce around an identity against it. And that, because the identity actually doesn't have anything in it, it's not an identity. Being an atheist doesn't mean you're for anything. It means you're against something. It kind of was vulnerable to being hijacked. And I think that may have been what's happened, because, as I said, you can be an atheist and a Trump supporter, or you can be an atheist and someone like Sam or Richard Dawkins, who think that, along with me, think that Trump is the worst thing that's ever happened to America.
Yeah, well, I think anyone does need to have a little bit of a political affiliation and a political identity that is broader than I'm against these people, I'm against this idea, and you sort of need to act more sort of strenuously, like look into what you believe and sort of hash that out, and also build coalition.
I know we've run out of time,
but yeah,
I know we've run out of time. But this is why I don't like the term classical liberalism, because it's basically the term that Friedrich von Hayek used because he didn't like the term libertarianism. It basically means free market, fiscal, economically free market, socially liberal. The term, the more encompassing term I like is enlightenment liberal, which is what I call myself on Twitter, because that's the liberalism. Enlightenment nails your colours to the mast and says, I'm against postmodernism. I mean, if you call yourself an enlightenment liberal, you are for everything that postmodernism and the so-called SJW mode of thinking is against. But enlightenment liberalism was, John Stuart Mill, who's sort of a lot of classical liberals say is a classical liberal. If you look at his economics was mildly socialist. He believed, like Sam Harris, he believed in some kind of basic income. That what we want to say is that we're in favour of, maximizing people's autonomy, maximizing people's ability to write their own life stories, which means both negative freedom and some positive freedom, some, welfare, some public provision of education, some public provision of a leg up for people who start behind in life, along with, freedom of speech, etc. Which is not, classical liberalism is kind of fetishizes only part of that legacy. It fetishizes the negative side. It fetishizes the side of that legacy which is about getting the state out of your life, and ignores the side of that legacy which is about using the state to both stabilize capitalism, that's the Keynesian side, and to provide a leg up to people who have been the victims of capitalism. Well, capitalism is great energy for making prosperity, but it screws people over.
Well, I think we can all agree that Dave Rubin's political terminology is fatally flawed.
Well, the problem with Dave is he's just not smart enough to realize when he says dumb things.
Well,
he said I believe in single payer, and then he described Obamacare.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah. I almost don't want to give people the benefit of the doubt of saying they're stupid. I want to say you're saying stuff that's wrong, and that's the problem. Anyhow, it's been good talking to you, man.
Yes. Look. I'm sorry we've gone on, but I think it's been a valuable conversation.
Yeah, we've hit a bunch of topics. I think we've interesting to talk to you, and hopefully people enjoyed listening to us.
Yes, and I will inevitably see you around in the next Twitter fight.
All right, take care.
Cheers, bye.